Let's decode one of the giants of 20th century thought, Michel Foucault. He was not just a philosopher, but also a historian, critic, and political activist. Interestingly, Foucault refused labels like structuralist or postmodernist. Instead, he carved out his own method, focused on three big ideas: power, discourse, and the making of the subject. Educated at the École Normale Supérieure, under teachers like Jean Hyppolite and Louis Althusser, Foucault blended philosophy with psychology, history, and cultural analysis. His influence is massive. It stretches across sociology, criminology, anthropology, communication, feminism, Marxism, and post-colonial theory. And here's something to pause and note. He became a key resource for thinkers like Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Edward Said, and Abdul Jan Mohammed, asked in exam. Later, his impact also shaped Judith Butler's Gender Trouble and Eve Kosofsky, Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet. This was also asked in exam. Now, let's walk through his major works. He began with The History of Madness in 1961 and The Birth of the Clinic in 1963, where he introduced his archaeological method. This was about digging into the past to show how institutions shaped what counted as rational. Then came The Order of Things in 1966 and The Archaeology of Knowledge in 1969, where he explored discursive structures and how societies redefine what is considered true. But his real breakthrough came with Discipline and Punish in 1975. Here, Foucault gave us the famous idea of panopticism, drawing on Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, and this was recently asked in exam. Imagine a prison where one guard can observe all prisoners, but the prisoners never know when they're being watched. Over time, they start to discipline themselves. This becomes a metaphor for modern surveillance, where power doesn't just punish, it makes us regulate ourselves. Then, in The History of Sexuality, published in 1976, Foucault expanded his theory of power knowledge. He argued that power is not only repressive, it is also productive. It shapes our desires, our identities, and even our bodies through discourse. Pause here, this is crucial for UGC NET. Among his major concepts are biopower or biopolitics, governmentality, subjectivation, heterotopia, limit experience, and parrhesia, which means truth-telling. His genealogical method, inspired by Nietzsche, showed how institutions like prisons, clinics, schools, and psychiatric wards control people by creating subjects that fit within certain regimes of truth. Foucault used the term episteme to describe the underlying conditions that define what can be known in a given historical period. He also emphasized visibility and surveillance, summed up in the concept of the gaze. He died in 1984 in Paris due to complications from HIV/AIDS, becoming the first major French public figure whose death was openly linked to the disease. Let's decode one of Michel Foucault's most influential works, The History of Madness, published in 1961. And pause here because this one was asked in your exam, so pay close attention. This book, later translated into English as Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, is not just about medicine or psychology. It's a radical critique of how European culture has dealt with madness across history from the Middle Ages right up to the 18th century. Foucault doesn't treat madness as a fixed condition. Instead, he shows us how definitions of insanity were shaped by law, politics, medicine, and philosophy. In other words, madness was never just a medical problem, it was always about power and knowledge. Foucault identifies three cultural phases in how societies treated madness. In the Renaissance, madness was often linked with tragic wisdom. Think of artists, poets, and visionaries. It was seen as something tied to the mysteries of human experience. But in the classical age, during the 17th and 18th centuries, madness became something to exclude. Institutions confined the insane, and reason was elevated as a disciplinary force. This was a turning point. Madness was no longer part of human truth, but a problem to be locked away. Finally, in the modern era, psychiatry entered the picture. Madness was redefined as an object of science and clinical observation, something doctors could categorize, diagnose, and control. Pause here and note this Foucault's argument is that madness has no single, timeless essence. It is always historically produced, shaped by cultural norms, institutions, and political practices. This marks his shift from earlier phenomenological influences towards a more structuralist way of thinking, laying the groundwork for his later archaeological and genealogical methods. So, can you recall what makes this book so important? Exactly, it teaches us that even something as natural as insanity is not purely medical, but deeply cultural and historical. That's why the history of madness remains one of Foucault's most powerful critiques of how societies define and discipline difference. Let's decode one of Michel Foucault's most important early works, The Birth of the Clinic, an archaeology of medical perception, published in 1963. Now, here's something to underline. This has been asked in exam, so keep it close to memory. Foucault takes us back to the late 18th century, right after the French Revolution. He argues that this political and social upheaval set the stage for something new, the rise of the modern medical institution, La Clinique, or the teaching hospital. Think of it this way. Just as priests once cared for the soul, doctors now became guardians of the body. The shift wasn't only about health, it was about power, about authority moving from religion into medicine. Pause here and note this phrase, le regard médical, or the medical gaze. This was also asked in exam. This is central to Foucault's argument. What does it mean? The medical gaze is the act of doctors reducing a person to just a body, a case, a collection of symptoms, the patient's lived experience, their story, their feelings. These fade into the background. What remains is an object of observation and diagnosis. Now, here's the golden trick. The clinic, in this new form, was not only a place of healing, it became a factory of knowledge. By dissecting bodies, classifying diseases, and mapping symptoms, doctors built a new regime of medical truth. Health and illness were no longer private experiences, they were socially regulated categories shaped by institutions. Can you recall what makes this book so influential? Exactly, it shows how medicine is never neutral. It participates in broader systems of power, shaping how society defines normal and abnormal, healthy and unhealthy. That's why Foucault's analysis resonates not only in literature and philosophy, but also in sociology, anthropology, social work, and even medical studies. So, The Birth of the Clinic stands as a key precursor to later post-structuralist critiques. By exposing how authority hides in everyday practices, even in the doctor's gaze, Foucault helps us see knowledge itself as a form of power. And that insight, my friend, changed the way we think about medicine, science, and truth itself. Let's decode one of Michel Foucault's most famous works, The Order of Things, an archaeology of the human sciences, published in 1966. This book is a turning point in Foucault's thought. At first glance, it looks close to structuralism, but in truth, it's where Foucault begins to go beyond structuralism and carve his own path. Foucault introduces the idea of discourse as a material practice, asked in exam. And pause here and note this carefully. For Foucault, discourse isn't just language, it's a system of rules and assumptions that shapes what we can think, what we can say, and even what we can believe to be true. In other words, discourse builds reality. From this foundation, Foucault gives us the concept of the episteme. Think of the episteme as the hidden framework of knowledge that silently governs each historical period. He maps out three major epistemes. First, the Renaissance, where knowledge worked through resemblance, analogy, and symbolic correspondences. Second, the classical age of the 17th and 18th centuries, where order, taxonomy, and representation dominated. And third, the modern episteme, beginning in the 19th century, which organized knowledge around life, labor, and language, giving rise to the human sciences like biology, economics, and linguistics. Can you see what's happening here? Foucault is showing us that truth is never timeless. It is always shaped by historical rules that silently regulate what counts as knowledge. So, truth itself is constructed. Now, let's turn to another fascinating idea, heterotopia. While utopias are imaginary, heterotopias are real spaces that exist in society but function as other. They are strange, paradoxical sites that mirror and disrupt cultural order at the same time. Pause here and think of examples: ships, cemeteries, prisons, brothels, fairs, and even gardens. These spaces disturb the normal order of things. They are zones where society's hidden structures become visible. Here's something you'll love. Just like epistemes reveal the hidden rules of thought, heterotopias reveal the hidden rules of space. Both ideas work together to show how power and culture shape what we take for granted as natural. So, the order of things is more than just history of knowledge. It's the foundation of Foucault's archaeological method, digging into the conditions that make knowledge possible. And it sets the stage for his later studies of power, subjectivity, and control. Let's decode one of Michel Foucault's most important works, The Archaeology of Knowledge, published in 1969. This is not a casual book of theory, it's his most explicit methodological guide. Here, Foucault lays out what he means by doing an archaeology of thought. Now, pause here and think, what does archaeology usually mean? Digging beneath the surface to uncover hidden layers. That's exactly what Foucault does with knowledge. Instead of telling smooth, linear stories of history, he digs down into the hidden rules and discontinuities that shape systems of thought. This is where an exam point comes in. Foucault introduces the idea of epistemes and discursive formations. Asked in exam, these are not just fancy terms. They mean that thought and knowledge are always structured by rules we don't even notice. These rules silently decide what is possible to say, what is thinkable, and what counts as knowledge at a given historical moment. Foucault says discourse is not just a transparent mirror of reality. It's produced by networks, institutions, practices, and statements that work together. And discourses don't evolve smoothly. They shift through ruptures, breaks, and sudden discontinuities. What looks like continuity often hides deep transformations. Can you recall what this means for authors? Exactly, Foucault dismisses the humanist idea that knowledge is simply the product of an individual author's creativity. Instead, he shifts attention to discourse itself, to the underlying systems that regulate what can and cannot be said. Pause and note this. The task of archaeology is not to celebrate authors, but to map the conditions of possibility that shape knowledge. This was radical because it moved theory away from subjective intention and towards structural rules. Finally, let's connect the dots. The archaeology of knowledge consolidates Foucault's earlier insights into epistemes, and it sets the stage for his later genealogical method, where discourse is studied as inseparable from power and institutions. In short, this book is the bridge between Foucault's archaeology of knowledge and his genealogy of power. So remember this 1969 Foucault, epistemes, discursive formations, and the hidden rules of knowledge. A classic UGC NET hotspot. Let's decode another landmark work by Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality, published in 1976. This text begins a multi-volume journey where Foucault examines how sexuality became such a central category in modern life. And yes, remember this carefully because it was asked in exam. Most people believed in what's called the repressive hypothesis. The idea was simple. Sexuality was silenced and repressed by capitalism and strict bourgeois morality from the 17th to the 20th century. But here's the twist. Foucault disagrees. He argues that sexuality was not repressed at all. Instead, it became a hot topic of discussion. Doctors, educators, legal authorities, they all encouraged people to confess, analyze, and classify their sexual behaviors. So rather than silence, there was an explosion of discourse about sex. Pause here and note this down. This discursive explosion placed sexuality right at the core of identity. People began to define themselves through sexuality. Foucault uses his famous methods, archaeology, and genealogy to show that sexuality is not just personal, it is shaped by power knowledge. It became a tool for regulation, a key mechanism in what he calls biopolitics. The first volume is called The Will to Knowledge. But the later volumes, The Use of Pleasure and the Care of the Self, take us back to Greek and Roman times. Foucault shows that for them, sexuality wasn't about fixed identities like heterosexual or homosexual. Instead, it was about ethics, self-mastery, moderation, and the care of the self. Can you recall what this means for modern thought? Exactly. It tells us sexuality is not a timeless essence. It is historically constructed, shaped by discourse, and tied to networks of power. Desire itself is not free, but disciplined, managed, and produced through culture. So, the big takeaway Foucault reveals how sexuality, far from being suppressed, actually became a key way in which modern subjects were defined and controlled. That's why the history of sexuality remains essential for understanding how desire and discipline intertwine in the making of identity. Let's decode another of Michel Foucault's powerful ideas, biopower and biopolitics. These terms first appeared in his lectures at the Collège de France and were expanded in The History of Sexuality, The Will to Knowledge, published in 1976. Now, here's something to pause and underline. Biopower was asked in exam. Traditionally, sovereign power was about the right to take life or let live. A king or ruler could kill or spare. But modern power works differently. Foucault explains that biopower operates not through death, but through life. It fosters, regulates, and manages life itself. It is about making live and letting die. Can you recall the two levels within biopower? Here's the golden trick. First comes the anatomopolitics of the human body. This is about disciplining individuals, shaping their bodies through schools, hospitals, armies, and workplaces. The second is biopolitics, which focuses not on individuals but on populations. It manages health, reproduction, disease, and mortality at the collective level. This too was asked in exam. So what does biopolitics really do? It turns the population into the central concern of governance. Through statistics, medical knowledge, and demographic studies, governments monitor and regulate life processes. Power becomes productive, not just repressive. It creates new knowledge and new ways of organizing life. Now let's connect this to another key Foucault term, governmentality again, asked in exam. This refers to modern forms of governance that combine political rationality, institutions, and techniques of control. Think of it as the art of managing populations for their health, security, and productivity. Pause here and reflect. Foucault is showing us that modern states no longer control people only through laws or punishment. Instead, they regulate life at its most basic biological level. We are disciplined as individuals and normalized as populations. In short, biopower is power over life. Biopolitics is the governance of populations, and governmentality is the broader framework that ties them all together. This shift changes how we understand authority in the modern world. It's not only about ruling bodies, it's about shaping life itself. Let's decode one of the most important shifts in literary theory, Michel Foucault's 1969 lecture, What is an Author? At first, it looks like he's asking a simple question. But Foucault isn't really interested in the author as a person. He is asking us to rethink what we mean when we say author. Pause here and note this down. It was asked in exam. Foucault gives us the concept of the author function. Instead of seeing the author as a unique genius who creates meaning, he says the author is really a cultural function. Society uses the idea of the author to classify, limit, and control how texts circulate. The author's name isn't just a name. It works like a label that decides how the text will be received, how legitimate it is, and even how much freedom readers have to interpret it. As Foucault puts it, the notion of author constitutes the privileged moment when discourse is tied to individuality. Don't miss this line, it was asked in exam. Now, Can you recall how this challenges the romantic view of the author? Exactly, the old idea of the author as a fountain of originality gets dismantled. Foucault says that instead of expanding meaning, the author actually restricts it. The author becomes a gatekeeper, narrowing the possibilities that language could have opened up. And remember, this author function doesn't operate the same way everywhere. In science, for example, the authority of a text rests less on the author's name and more on truth and demonstration. But in literature, interpretation still revolves heavily around the author's identity. Here's a classic example. Foucault refers to the 1001 Nights. Yes, this was asked in exam. This text survives and thrives without a single authorial figure uniting it. The story keeps cycling, expanding, and circulating independently of the idea of a personal author. Now here's something to highlight. The essay also connects writing with death. Foucault suggests that in writing, the author essentially disappears, leaving behind only discourse. Meaning continues, but without being tied to a single person's life or biography. Pause here and note this carefully. It was asked in exam. Foucault concludes by urging us to stop obsessing over authenticity, originality, or the life of the writer. Instead, critics should focus on how discourse functions, how it exists, circulates, and gets appropriated. And this is where he defines authorship as a variable and complex function of discourse. This exact phrase has been asked in exam. So, in short, Foucault breaks the myth of the author as a supreme source of meaning. He shows us that the author is really a cultural and institutional construct. And once that construct is questioned, interpretation opens up to wider possibilities.